My name's Robert Allen and I'm APM Branches Manager, and I'll be your host for this evening. You probably just saw me and Richard tidying our hair. Apologies for that. But delighted that you can join us tonight for the role of Supervisor NEC5. Richard has kindly given up his...
What's this NEC5 malarkey?
Well, this is the fifth one you've done for us.
Oh, sorry. You're confusing me. We're talking NEC4, not NEC5.
No, I haven't created a new NEC, but
Okay,
Richard has kindly given his time to share a lot of great information on NEC, and tonight will be no different. I should warn everyone, this webinar does come with a health warning. Richard does like, on occasions, to shout at you, keep you on your toes, make sure you're still with us. But more importantly, Richard, happy to take your questions throughout. So please post those in your control panel, and at suitable times, I'll try and interrupt and pose those to Richard. Tonight we'll go on for anywhere between an hour to an hour and a half, really depending on how many questions you submit, but the maximum length will be an hour and a half. So really it does give me great pleasure to pass over to Richard, who has kindly given up his time again to share on NEC. Richard works for Mott, MacDonald. So Richard, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Robert. I'll go back to my slides then. I'll get my picture out of the way because I can't see a thing with that in the way. I don't really need to see myself. So yeah, good evening, everybody. Session today, I've been asked to do a series of 6 sessions for APM. These come from sessions we routinely do across Mott MacDonald, and this one is specifically about the role of the supervisor within the NEC's main construction contract. That's the ECC, the Engineering and Construction Contract. Housekeeping is a bit irrelevant because you're all probably at home. That one we don't worry about. We have already asked you, I think, where you're calling in from, and what we tend to do is we'll put the result of those polls go into the sort of the shared presentation that we share at the end of the day. And okay, Robert's pulled in and he's now asking you, what industry do you work in? Just give us a quick type in there just to make it a little bit more live so we can see where you are. Highways, obviously, NEC contracts are used extensively across the highways world. What are you called now? National highways are very heavily used. International development, I'd love to say that NEC is widely used internationally, but I'd be lying. But it is used internationally and it can be used internationally. It's definitely used in ports and power and nuclear. Communities, I'm not quite sure what we mean by communities and industry, but it's used for a lot of local authority and community type work, buildings, and so on and so forth. So the fact that you're all coming in from different industries is an indication that NEC can be used across those industries, and it is. NEC, as you may know, it's got the word construction in the title, but the contract really is just a contract for a project, and it can be used for pretty much anything. Rail, and they're flying in. Okay, and was there another one? I can't remember where we go next. Yeah, so just a quick poll, which side of the fence are you on? Are you consultant, contractor, subcontractor, client, owner? Just to give a rough idea. Typically we end up with mainly consultants because consultants are enthusiastic and seem to have the time for these things. Good to get the clients and contractors on board as well. And again, sort of unsurprising, we don't get enough subcontractors and people actually doing real work at these events. Thank you very much for that. Was there another one, Robert? I can't remember. Oh yeah, in terms of actually your experience of the supervisor role, just give us a rough feel, just one totally random, not marked, you're not scored on this, but just to give a feel for us. Quite a few low and zero, a few people with a medium know a bit what I'm talking about. Hopefully you'll come up with the good questions. Well, you can all come up with some good questions, and that just gives me a feel for what we're doing. So we are talking from basics here, from first principles. So there will be some stuff which is really boring if you know this stuff and do it for a day job. That said, if you do, it won't do any harm to reinforce it. And like I say, hopefully we get some good questions. Next.
That's all the questions, Richard. So
come back to me then. Show my screen. We're back to it. Okay. So, like we said, this is the supervisor's role. This is the one that's at the end of the year, towards the end of the year in Mott MacDonald. We've got another one coming up, the last one of the 6, which is actually not on here. It's a specific one on the key changes between Ec3 and NEC4. Now, a lot of you will be working for clients who are either using NEC4 already or thinking about it. There's absolutely no common sense reason not to be using NEC4 now. So hopefully that will be useful to you in, might say, my last session next month. That's me. I'll just do a little bit of an introduction. I've been with MacDonald since I was in short trousers. I qualified as a dams engineer, wandered into contracts and specialised therein. And in particular, I focus very much on NEC contracts. What have I done now? Let's get rid of that one. Excuse me. Let's go back to that one. Good. Hopefully you've got that on your screen. I'll get rid of it anyway. Done that one, done that one, done that one. That's not too relevant for today. That's the basic structure of what we're going to do today. The basic role of the supervisor. Some detail on what the NEC3 calls the works information. NEC4 calls the scope. That's just a name change. And how the scope affects what you as a supervisor have got to do. That's all sort of pre-contract stuff. Then we move on to the key elements of the supervisor's role in actually managing the contract. To be clear, the supervisor does not exist until the contract is signed. That said, people with supervisor skills can really be very useful in reviewing and checking that scope stroke works information document before the contract goes out the door. So fundamentally, that's where we're talking about. We've got an employer, another small name change between NEC3 and NEC4. You'll hear me today, 1 minute I'll be talking employer, the next minute I'll talk client. It's just a name change. NEC3 was employer, NEC4 is client. So what we're talking about is the ECC, Engineering Construction Contract, which is between an employer and a contractor. And the employer may well have advisors and or designers to help them put this contract together. But when it comes to managing the contract on their behalf, ECC is possibly unique in having two distinct roles. One is the project manager, the other is where we are tonight, which is the supervisor. More detail on the split coming up, I'm pretty sure. And those people can be in-house employees of the employer, or if you need to recruit in somebody else from a consultancy, then you might want to use the NEC Professional Services Contract, the PSC, or to be honest, for what's a relatively straightforward role to define, you should be using the Professional Services Short Contract to employ that organisation to provide that person to be the supervisor or the project manager. That's just one slide there. So 1 to 8 there. I really should put 9 on there as well. But there's 9 parts to the ECC contract, and those are the titles to those parts. And I just like this slide as a real high-level summary as to who's doing what. And you can see there the supervisor is totally focused on testing and defects. There's a little bit about marking plant and materials to show title in section 7. But make it clear that everything else is done by the project manager. Now, it doesn't mean the project manager might not want some help from the person who is also the supervisor, but you need to get in your head that they are very clearly delineated roles. On some projects, a client might have, we have some projects where they might have employed a different consultant, heaven forbid, as project manager, and have MacDonald, for example, as the supervisor, because we know technical and we can do that stuff. Obviously, we can do the left-hand side as well. But you need to understand that there are two different roles. So, for example, early warning. We had a presentation already about early warning. That's only done by the project manager and the contractor. The supervisor cannot notify an early warning. That has to come through the project manager. And a little bit of extra detail. In certain clauses, there are specific periods stated. In other clauses, namely design acceptance and subcontractor acceptance, there is no stated period for response, and therefore a term called the period for reply, which you'll see there is in italics, which is NEC code to say that it's actually a period stated in the contract data, which is one element of the contract. So in there, typically we have the period for reply is X weeks. Typically X in the UK is 2 weeks. and that will be the default period for acceptance of design and subcontractors. But you don't need to worry about that because you're the supervisor. As you can see from the picture, that's a project manager's role. While we're here, get your head around the idea that the ECC, hang on a minute, I'm going to talk in italics, ECC Project Manager in italics, that's the person who's actually doing all these contractual roles. They may also be the client's project manager, small p, small m. So project manager and supervisor are very distinct roles of the clauses and things to be done in accordance with the contract. So typically the supervisor, people will say, well, it's like a clerk of works, isn't it? Clerk of works is a term I think came out mainly through JCT, which is one of the standard building contracts. And the clerk of works typically is an experienced construction person who wanders around the site and taps the contractor on the hat and says, well, that's not very good. Can you get that changed? That's lovely, but beware, the supervisor role is very definitely a contractual role, and the person doing it needs to be trained and to do things properly in accordance with the contract. Their fundamental role, and it doesn't say this in black and white anywhere, but what they're really doing is monitoring how well the contractor is, NEC language, providing the works in accordance with the works information, or remember the scope, NEC3 works information, NEC4 scope. So your supervisor is a quality monitoring role. And because of that, the scope document is absolutely critical. And I picked that out with a few key clauses. 20.1 says the contractor does what it says on the tin. Sorry, no, it says provides the works in accordance with the works information. There's a lovely clause 54.1 which says the activity schedule, well, it's not works information. The activity schedule is not for today, is a pricing document. And there's just that lovely clause which says, well, it's not works information. So the contractor's only got to do what it says in the works information. And then by far the most common compensation event in NEC is 60.11 because the project manager has flipping well changed the works information. And the project manager will change that works information for a genuine change of mind, and possibly more often than not, I've got no data, but too often the project manager has to change that works information to correct an ambiguity in poorly drafted works information. So from a contractor's perspective, very simple. If it ain't in the works information, the contractor doesn't have to do it. Hence the importance of writing a good works information when you're drafting your contract. And because of all that, and because it's your job to monitor compliance with that scope, I'm going to use an EC4 term, let's call it scope tonight. The supervisor's got to know that scope inside out. So now a couple of really dull slides, I'm sorry. The contract has a number of references, I've given you the clause references in here, where within the conditions there's a specific requirement to say something in the scope. So for example, the works to be done by the completion date have to be stated clearly in the scope. If there are any health and safety requirements, any specific health and safety requirements, they have to be stated in the scope. And I'm not going to read out everything on the slide because that's boring, but what I have done here is show the stuff in green, or is it blue, I'm not really sure, is of direct importance to you, the supervisor, whereas the other stuff, these other clauses in black, you need to know about, but it's the project manager's job because it's the project manager, for example, accepting the contractor's designs. So the green stuff, supervisor, take note. And there's more of these. I'm sorry, they're dull. Working with the others, cooperating and sharing with the working areas as stated in the works information. The employer provides services as stated in the works information. And when you get round to takeover, the employer is actually allowed to use parts of the works without taking them over, as long as it's stated in the scope, ... So you need to be aware of that as a supervisor. Most important thing for you, Mr. Supervisor, is tests and inspections. Some of those, as we'll see, might be done by the contractor, some might be done by you, but we don't have to do anything unless it's stated in the works information. You can see the detail on there as well, all green and therefore all relevant to you, the supervisor. Even when we get into the secondary and the main options, there are some elements that need words in the works information. The one that's relevant really to the supervisor, because it's to do with testing, is if the client has used option Ec3, which is called low performance damages. Now, it doesn't get used as often as it should do, but if the client has stated a certain level of performance that they want from the works, then it's meaningless unless they define a test to measure whether or not the works provides that level of performance, and those tests will be in the works information and will require to be reviewed and viewed at least by the supervisor. So that's it. That's the pre-contract stuff. That wasn't very hard, was it? It's all very simple. Guess what? Read what it says in the contract.
Richard, could I step in there with a question?
You please can, because it's a wonderful breakpoint.
Perfect. So Gary has asked, in the term service contract, is the service manager covering both roles, project manager and supervisor?
Very, very good question. And the simple answer is yes. Because the term service contract, for whatever reason, has decided not to do that split between, in the TSC language, service manager and supervisor. There is no supervisor. There's no supervisor in the term service contract, but there are still all the similar clauses about testing and defects. But whoever asked the question is completely right. Those are done by the same person or the same role, the service manager, which is the equivalent in the term service contract to the project manager here in the ECC that we're talking about tonight. So when the service manager, under TSC is setting up, if it's a decent sized contract, there'll be more than one person helping out, and it might be very sensible to delegate to one person all of those quotes supervisory type roles to a particular person to support them to be doing those testing and defects type roles. Good question.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Gary, for the question. No more questions, Richard. Thank you.
Okay, because that's all very dull so far, isn't it? Okay, so contract manager. First off, it was a flippin' stupid term. Sorry, because the supervisor is not supervising anything or anybody. I was a small part of the team that helped steer NEC3 to NEC4, and I was actually advocating that we just change the name to inspector, but this is too much there's too much history really. We're used to a supervisor, so it wasn't changed. But fundamentally, if you think about the role as an inspector, you won't be very far off the truth, and that will be hopefully illustrated in today's presentation. Your job is to monitor compliance. A little top tip here, if you happen to be a consultant, don't let anybody tell you you're there to ensure compliance, because you can't ensure compliance because you are not doing it. It's the contractor that's doing it, and the contractor who should be trying to ensure compliance. All you can do as supervisor is to monitor how well they're doing. So simple clauses in 14. Lovely line here. The contractor's acceptance doesn't change the contractor's responsibility to provide the works, or his or its liability for his or its design. I put that slide in with the funny stuff in purple. The purple is NEC4 rather than NEC3, just to remind you that wonderfully in NEC4, not everybody is a bloke. In NEC3, everyone's a bloke. It's him and it's his, and the supervisor, his, him, whatever, which is wrong. NEC4 has corrected that, so we are now wonderfully gender neutral. So anything, when you do any acceptance, it doesn't mean that you actually change the contractor's responsibility. As a PM or as a supervisor, you may delegate any of your actions. Part of my day job today, I actually reviewed a delegation of a supervisor's roles for a job, would you believe it, in Sierra Leone, where we're doing a massive water project in Sierra Leone, and DFID, as they used to be called, are using the NEC. And that's a very simple clause. You just say to the contractor, I give Fred the authority to act under the following roles. Very simple, but it needs to be done as a project startup activity so everybody knows who we're talking to. And again, it's a little bit tangential, but if you're the contractor and you start getting instructions from anybody who has not been giving a delegated action, you should flag an early warning to the project manager and say, look, who is this character trying to give me instructions? I'm only going to take instructions from people who have been delegated the authority to do so. Simple point, but quite important. Very critical clause in ECC, the project manager may instruct a change to the scope, 14.3. The project manager, not the supervisor. If it wanted to say the supervisor, it would have said it. It doesn't. So you, the supervisor, you have not got the authority to change any requirements in the contract. Very important. You might see things that you think need changing, but you're going to have to do that through your friend, the project manager. So that person, as I've already intimated, could be employees, they could be independent organizations. In the extreme case, on a simple contract, they could be the same person with 2 roles and 2 hats, the supervisor and the project manager. Either way, they are separate roles, but you do, again, as we'll show throughout today's presentation, you do need to talk to each other. It's not rocket science, but it will help. Appointment and delegation. I try to do things in pictures whenever I can. That's what we've got. When we've got the employer with also with some helping hand from the project manager and the supervisor to do specific things in the contract. Those people, as we've already said, can delegate actions. There might also be, quite often, there are also technical designers for some sort of technical support. They might be MacDonald is quite often employed in that role as well. But again, the slide emphasizes the fact that those people are not the supervisor or the project manager. Likewise, cost consultants, quite often employed to support the PM, but they can't actually do anything under the contract unless they've been given delegated authority so to do. And adds in there the sort of, once they have been delegated, then of course they can communicate directly with the contractor. Quite a complicated slide for a fairly simple thing, really. So now we're going to get into the detail, managing the contract, and we're going to focus really on those 3 key things: the general stuff, testing and defects, and title. So general, number 1, start at the beginning. My favorite slide, okay? I get very enthusiastic about this slide. The employer, the contractor, the project manager, and the supervisor shall act as stated in this contract and in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. I love this clause. There has been loads of words written on this clause. If you're watching LinkedIn and stuff recently, and if you're sad and follow NEC things, you'll see there was a court case recently which gave a little bit of weight to that spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. But there's been thousands of words written on it. I don't care. This is the slide that you need to make your NEC have a chance of succeeding. What I do in training, I get people to try and tell me what they think are the key words in here. The first key word is shall act as stated. And that sets up the fact that the whole of the contract is written in the present tense. So when it says the project manager notifies an early warning, ... it's not if they feel like it, they shall notify an early warning. Likewise, the supervisor shall ... So my summary of that is do what it says in the chuffing contract. And apologies for use of the word chuffing, but I like it. But to be able to do what it says in the chuffing contract, you're first going to have to read the chuffing contract. And that applies to the supervisor as well as to everybody else. That's the easy bit. The hard bit is the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. And always I ask people, if you've got a relationship, if you've got a partner, a husband, a wife, a girlfriend, whatever, how do you maintain that spirit of mutual trust and cooperation? If nothing else, I hope you taltio. Chuffing, talk and listen to each other. And if you, as a team in NEC, can't get everybody to agree to do those 3 things, your contract will fail. It's very simple. The bit that you've got to recognize is that you do have to do what it says in the contract, which means being, I say this quietly, contractual. You can be contractual without getting, wait for it, contractual! It's quoting clauses at me! That's okay, because we're doing what it says in the contract. Very simple. That's split into 2 sentences in EC4, but it makes no real effect, no real difference. So simple PowerPoint, that slide, but probably the most important one for today. So the contract has set up with a bit of language. Anything in italics is a term identified in the contract data. Whenever you see a capital letter, hopefully it's pretty obvious, it's a defined term, and you're going to have to read them. So take some time out of your day to go and read these terms, make sure you understand what they mean. Completion is critical for you as a supervisor. We're all working towards getting to a stage where the project manager, not you, can sign off on completion. But to achieve completion, as you can see on the slide, you've got to have done all the works that the works information requires for completion, and also have no defects around that would prevent the client from using the works. Even the word defect is a defined term, and there's 2 types of defect. We'll see a bit more detail on that later. The last job of the supervisor is to issue the defect certificate, and we've talked about works information. To do all this stuff in NEC, there's a few key clauses. Firstly, 13.1, everything's got to be in writing. And that's really simple, but it does mean, Mr. Supervisor, that you can't give verbal instructions to do anything. You're just going to confuse things by giving verbal instructions. And then, to be honest, there's very limited instructions that you as a supervisor can give. So get it in writing. And critically, if it's required to be notified, then it has to be notified and communicated separately. That's a clause, general clause 13.7. To do all this, you are going to need a decent system. Now that might be just email and some standard Word forms, but in the modern world, can we please use one of the in the cloud systems which helps us to run NEC contracts? I'm sure some of you out there are already using these, and anybody that's used one would never ever go back to please find attached. So contract that we've got to use, we've got to get and be contractual. It's not, as we used to say in the old days, the best place for a contract is definitely not in the bottom drawer. Before we get started, we're going to stop the work. Sounds a bit radical, but once again, it's the project manager that can instruct the contractor to stop or not start any work. That's not going to happen very often, one would hope. You could stop the work because they're not doing it very well. You could stop the work because of a health and safety issue. My only reason for putting this slide up is to suggest that you at least think about whether the supervisor, who is typically on site for more days a week than the project manager, not always, but typically, it's quite normal to have a supervisor to be delegated and therefore allowed to act in respect of that clause, specifically in relation to health and safety issues. You could extend that to issues where the supervisor considers that the work is being carried out in such a way that would lead to a defect, perhaps. But again, you've got to be careful as supervisor, because it's really the contractor's job to get it right first time. Okay, testing and defects. This is the meat of the supervisor's role, but part 4 of the contract has precisely 1.5 pages. So every supervisor worth their salt, I nearly said his, in which case I would have had to slap myself on the head. Every supervisor worthy of the title should be able to read and recite that 1.5 pages of text. It's not hard. Believe me, it's not hard. So these tests and inspections, they're all between the contractor and the supervisor. Now, it's not always the case, but sometimes I would recommend that we identify in the contract data as a key person the contractor's quality manager, so that we know from the start that we've got a clear person that the supervisor should be talking to about tests, inspections, and defects. The whole clause only applies if these tests and inspections have been stated as required in the works information. The contract also says that materials, facilities, samples, and blah, blah, blah are provided as stated in the works information. Typically, the works information would say they're all provided by the contractor unless stated otherwise, but that's up for you to decide as you write your works information. Simple clause, the contractor and the supervisor inform the other of their tests before the start, and afterwards informs the other of the results. It's all very simple. We've got a whole, on a decent sized construction project, there will be thousands of tests and thousands of results. One would hope that they would all be managed and databased in accordance with the contractor's quality management system, but that may not always be the case. Contractor informs the supervisor in time for a test or inspection to be done, and the supervisor may watch any test. Very simple words. If the test or inspection does show a defect, which will then require to be notified by the supervisor or the contractor corrects that defect and we do the test again. Very, very simple words in section 4. What there isn't in NEC, and you could give a whole training course on NEC, I've not done this one yet, a whole training course on what's not in the contract, but there is no specific reference to what a lot of people in our industry call the ITP, the Inspection and Testing Plan. That document does not exist in the standard NEC unless somebody has written that into the scope document. But drum roll, new for NEC 4, clause 40 is completely new. All of a sudden we have an obligation to operate a quality management system complying with the scope. So the scope is going to have to say ISO 9000 and something. Also, at the start of the job, the contractor provides the project manager with a quality policy statement and a quality plan for acceptance. Odd this bit, because this quality stuff, quality plan, is coming not to the supervisor who's doing all the testing and defects throughout the contract, but it's coming to the project manager for their acceptance. Common sense would be that the PM would discuss that with the supervisor first. The only real reference to the quality plan is that if the PM can instruct the contractor to correct a failure to comply with that quality plan, and that instruction is not a compensation event. There's a very light touch with quality, and there's no words about what a quality plan contains, I assume, because that would normally be set out in any decent quality management system. All those words have basically been copied across from the professional services contract. As I've just mentioned, PM and not supervisor. A little bit of detail you don't really need, but be aware that the idea of submitting your policy statement for the acceptance of the project manager is a little bit odd. You know, Mott, MacDonald, for example, you know, we've got, like all of your companies have got a policy statement. It's up there. It's on the wall in all the offices. It's in the system. The idea of having that to be subject to the acceptance of the project manager is slightly odd. But that's just a new little bit in front. Into the meter stuff now then. What is a defect? Well, go and have a look, because it's in a capital letter. You've got to read the contract. Anything not in accordance with the scope, and then also part of the works designed by the contractor, not in accordance with the law or the contractor's design, which the PM has been accepted. And this is a classic one, because under the contract, it's the PM that does all the acceptance or otherwise of the contractor's design. But you're all intelligent people. You can see from the slide in front of you that the supervisor needs to be able to see those contractors' designs. Because if they don't build in accordance with those contractors' designs, it's a defect. And that's what the job of the supervisor is. Nowhere in the NEC's conditions does it tell the project manager to share the accepted designs with the supervisor. But hopefully you can see that that's a little bit of common sense that needs to be added to make the contract work. So one picture for testing and defects. 40.1 says we've got to set out what they are. And in my words here, they might be prior to delivery. They might be what gets called in the industry, I work in the water sector, so we talk about our FATs, factory acceptance tests. There's typically going to be routine set tests on sites, like your concrete cube tests. There's always, particularly if there's mechanical and electrical equipment, there are likely to be some tests to demonstrate completion. And as we've already mentioned, if we have Ec17, there need to be some tests to demonstrate the performance guarantees that relate to Ec17. So different types of tests, all of those have got to be in your scope. And for each of those tests, got to be clear who's going to do it, who's going to provide the facilities, and exactly what are the price criteria. That's all common sense, I would hope, but you won't find any of that in the NEC words themselves. You might find it in the guide notes, but that's just background as to what needs to be here. In summary, some of those tests will be done by the contractor, of which some of them will be stated as to be required to be watched by the supervisor. Some other tests might be done only by the supervisor. It's up to you when you write your scope document. You do the tests, you notify the results. I've given you the clause numbers there. And if you fail the tests, then it's your job, Mr. Supervisor. Did I say Mr.? I'm sorry. It's your job, gender neutral supervisor, to notify the defect, 42.2. You're also, the one thing that you can instruct the contractor to do is to search for defects. That's 42.1. Obviously, if you search for defects and you find a defect, then you've got to notify it under 42.2. Also, there might be some inspections that you do. And guess what? If you inspect something and find a defect, you've got to notify it. You can see I'm just trying to show this as a simple picture. When you notify a defect, the supervisor, logically, but this is not in the contract again, logically, you're going to add it to a list. We all like lists, don't we, to keep track of things. You're going to put it on a list of defects. And then when we get to the defects date, which is at the end of a period, typically 12 months after completion, but it's whatever it says in the contract data, then close to that date or soon after that date, you have to issue what's called the Defect Certificate. And that Defect Certificate is the first time that it mentions a list, because a Defect Certificate is either a list of outstanding defects that haven't been corrected or a statement that there aren't any. So that's my one hopefully simple picture trying to show you what's going on with testing and defects in an ECC contract. Clearly, you as a supervisor are heavily involved in those various processes. So negative. You're just so negative. Pause for dramatic effect. I'll let you read it. You probably already have done. So you're required to notify to the contractor that these plant and materials, which have to have an inspection before coming on site or into the working areas, you actually notify the contractor that they have passed the test because you've read the test results and you say, okay. That is the only positive thing that the supervisor does. Everything else is negative, negative, negative. Defect, defect, defect. So what is a defect? Part of the work's not in accordance with the scope. Part of the work, we've already seen that stat already before. We've got a bit of duplication here, but you've got twice the chance to see it. Not in accordance with the contractor's design. There's no snags. This is one, if you want to really annoy a Richard Patterson in a training course, you start talking about snags. We don't have snags. We don't have NCRs, non-conformance reports, all that other random quality language. It's the contract. Do what it says in the contract. Is it a defect? Yes. Notify it as a defect. We only have defects today. Please get that across into your mind and into the mind of anybody else working on NEC. So this is your main role. Until the defects date, the supervisor and the contractor notify the other as soon as they become aware of a defect. So you notify the defect. In the modern world, there's probably going to be a photo of that defect. You'll give that defect a number. Doesn't say that in the contract, but it's common sense. And you'll stick it on the defects list. Remember, those notifications have to be separate. So strictly speaking, if you wander around the site in the morning and you find 4 different defects, they've got to be separately communicated, defect number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Requirements for testing. I think we've covered all that in a previous slide. I'm sorry. If we do show a defect, then supervisor notify it, contractor corrects the test and repeats. And there's also a nice clause in there for the client. The project manager assesses the cost to the employer in repeating a test. So if there is a specific overtime for the supervisor to come in and see a repeat test, then in theory, that amount of money gets charged to the contractor. Common sense to keep track of all this, we do need a clear testing plan and record system. Ideally, that will be part of the contractor's QA/QC system. If anybody out there is doing this for real, I'd love to see a decent article in the NEC newsletter specifically on the interface between NEC and a decent quality management system. I haven't seen that article yet. Please have a go at writing it for us. Clearly you need a simple form. NEC's got a simple form, and you also need a list. What we've got in MacDonald is a standard form. What we've got in MacDonald is my spreadsheet trying to keep track of the list of defects. This is not an NEC document. This is a Richard Patterson MacDonald starter. It's not right, it's not wrong, but it's better than a blank sheet of paper for a supervisor starting out on their day job. When we correct defects, the contractor obviously is required to correct a defect, and they've got to correct it within the end, before the end of the square brackets relevant defects correction period. This is stated in 44.2 in ECC4. Got a nice picture for that to come up. One other thing that's missing in the NEC, and it's important from this perspective, there is no formal clause under which you as the supervisor confirm to the contractor that that defect has been properly corrected. It's just not in the contract. The only point when that's going to come out is when you get to the end, the year after completion. Is that defect still on your defects list, or has it gone? If you've seen and are happy that it's been properly corrected, common sense says you'll take it off of your list. But I'm just telling you that there's no formal process for that anywhere in the contract. But the supervisor and the contractor's quality manager, common sense, they've got to agree to a process for the contractor to grab hold of the supervisor, say, come out on site, have a look at that. Can you confirm it's okay? Yes, it's okay, move on. If we've already taken over the works after completion and there are still defects, then there's an obligation on the PM to arrange for the employer, the client, sorry, to provide access to correct that defect. And we're probably going to get into a nice picture. Yes, we got a nice picture here. So these are some dates in the NEC contract that some of you will be aware of. The contract date is when the contract comes into existence. Date of completion, obviously, is when we've completed. And this defects date is just a period after the date of completion. If we notify a defect there, the contractor does not have to correct it straight away. They have to correct it within one defects correction period. It's in italics! That means it's in the contract data. It'll say 2 weeks or 4 weeks or something. You've got that period from the date of completion to correct the defect. But you won't get completion unless these 2 bullet points have been satisfied. Second bullet point, you've corrected notified defects which would have prevented the client from using the works. So if the defect we've got will prevent the client from using the works, then we're going to have to correct the defect before completion, otherwise we won't get completion. Common sense. Now, again, as I say in training, when's a good time to let the contractor know whether or not we think this defect will stop completion? Logically, when you notify it, but it doesn't say that in the contract. But I would suggest it's a good idea for the PM and the supervisor to have a quick chat about that defect, agree as it's being notified whether or not it's going to stop completion, and say so to the contractor. That's one of the columns in my suggested defects list. If we notify a defect after completion, the defects correction period starts at the date that's been notified. I'm lying. It actually starts when the PM has arranged access to correct that defect. We can even notify a defect the day before the defects date, and the contractor's still got a defects correction period to fix it. Very simple. The defects date, I like to call the supervisor go home date, because that's the date when you're, or very close to the date when you're going to do your last action as a supervisor. And critically, the defects date is the last date for you to instruct to search for a defect or to notify a defect. So like I say, after that, go home. Round about here, supervisor issues that final thing called the defect certificate. There is only one of them. There is only one defects date. I'm not sure whether that's going to crop up in the presentation now. I can't remember. But even if we have sectional completion, there is still only one defects date. And sometimes that causes problems for contractors and might need a change to your contract. The period from there to there, I love to call it the period with no name, because it hasn't got a name. It's not the maintenance period. It's not the defects liability. Just don't try and call it a name. It's just a number of weeks stated in the contract data from the date of completion. Again, quite a lot of information on that one slide. I hope it's making sense. If not, then I'm hoping you're compiling some decent questions. And I've said this already, there's no formal process for accepting that a defect has been corrected. I just feel that if I put it in big letters, I've got another chance to get it across. Accepting defects. Okay, so I've got this new Patterson idea of the Supervisor Sandwich. Part 4 of the contract is called the Supervisor Sandwich, because if you remember, the PM's accepting the quality plan at the start, the supervisor's doing all the grunt work of notifying and sorting out defects, and then at the end, typically, if we want to accept a defect, then clause 45 has a little deal where the contractor can propose that a defect is not corrected and say, look, come on, let me off. I tell you what, I'll knock off $1,000 and I'll finish a week early. That's a good deal, isn't it? And that's all it is. It's just a deal to do a deal to accept the defects. But it's the PM that's doing that, not the supervisor. And while I'm here, common sense doesn't say it in the contract, but common sense says the PM will talk very closely to the client before they start doing deals to accept defects, because the client obviously thinks they're going to get something which is as per the works information that they wrote. If the defects remain uncorrected, in fact, if they haven't corrected a defect within the defects correction period, those were on the slide I showed earlier, then the PM steps in again and the contractor is charged effectively. And it's a bit subtle in here. There's two different things. If the contractor has been given access and still hasn't corrected the defect, then the contractor is charged what the employer would have to pay to get somebody else in to fix it. If, on the other hand, the contractor hasn't been given the access, then the contractor is still charged, but it's a little bit less. In this case, it's whatever it would have costed the contractor to correct it. That amount in each case is determined by the PM, and if the contractor doesn't like that amount, the only place they've got to go is to the dispute resolution process. Okay, completion and takeover. We're getting towards the end, you'll be glad to know. That's what completion is. We've seen the definition twice already. Supervisor's job as we go through is to look after those tests, but it's a PM that certifies the completion. And after completion, typically, well, no, the standard is for takeover within 2 weeks after completion has been certified. There's a risk transfer on takeover. There's insurance requirements for the employer to sort, so they've got a couple of weeks to sort it out. There's a little caveat. There's a one-liner in the contract data which allows the employer to state whether or not they will take over if the contractor finishes early. In other words, before the required completion date. And whenever there is takeover, it's the PM who certifies that takeover. This is all very straightforward, isn't it? I'm hoping it's worth your time. We'll see. The supervisor ultimately issues the defect certificate, and the language is tweaked and changed, but the defect certificate is, I think I've already mentioned, it's just a list of those defects that contractor hasn't corrected, or if there aren't any, it's just a statement to say there aren't any. It's that simple. And like I mentioned before, that list, that's the only time NEC uses the word list of defects. So in theory, you could magic this list up at the end of the job, but that doesn't make any sense. Surely you're going to maintain that list as you go through the works. Bit of protection for the employer. Whatever it says in that defect certificate, the employer's rights in respect of a defect are not affected by the defect certificate. So whether or not it's been found or reported, if there's a defect in the works, the employer's rights, typically in the UK, the employer's got the right to chase the contractor for 6 years or 12 years, depending on whether the contract has been signed as a deed. So those rights are not affected by the defect certificate. As we've already said, too much repetition in here, but never mind. The PM comes in, I put that in red. The reason I put it back in here is because the defect certificate tells the project manager there's still 3 defects outstanding. Then the PM says, right, that's $3 grand, $5 grand, and $10 grand. I'm going to knock off the next payment assessment. Defect certificate is one action of the supervisor that is not normally delegated. Leave that to the named person who is the supervisor. And another little top really practical tip, that defects date, as I've already shown you, is typically a year after completion. Everybody's gone home. Everybody's on their next job. Everybody's forgotten about this project. For God's sake, get the date in your diary, because the supervisor's job is to issue that defect certificate. And if you're being the supervisor, you're being paid to do the supervisor. So can I genuinely ask you to do your job properly? When do we issue it? Subtle change in language between NEC3 and NEC4. Worry about the detail when you're doing it, but it's clear. It's clear, and it's somewhere around about the defects date. Title, last little bit. The contractor's title passes to the employer when it's come into the working areas, always. If it's outside the working areas, then that title is only transferred when it's been marked by the supervisor as for this contract. So this is the only job that the supervisor has got outside of part 4, which is all the testing and defect stuff I've bored you with so far this evening. And it's your job to go off to those places and mark that equipment as the works information requires. So whoever's writing the works information needs to think about that. I mean, typically, if we're marking mechanical electrical kit, we might actually have the supervisor physically going out there with stamps to stamp in the name of the employer on the physical bits of kit to show the world that those are now have the title, to show the world that the title has been transferred to the employer. Title, we're talking ownership here, for those who don't know. Be aware the contractor can only pass the title that it's got, and you might need procedures for what the lawyers call vesting, and those vesting procedures are not in the standard NEC. That's something I see working on UK government clients' contracts. Quite often we have a little additional clause talking about vesting. That's not the supervisor's worry, perhaps, but I dropped it in here because we're talking about title. The period with no name. Oh, I've given you this one, I think. What have I done in here? Oh yeah, this is just one slide to pull everything we've just done onto one slide. So completion is certified by the PM. The PM in this period between the date of completion and the typical 12 months of the defects date, the PM has still got to carry on making routine payment assessments, typically once a month. There's a specific assessment at completion. In that completion certificate, if there is any retention, which is option X16, the retention is halved at completion. And if it's a target option, that's the first time we make a preliminary assessment of the contractor's pain or gain, contractor's share, as we call it in NEC. As we go through, takeover we've mentioned. Takeover has a follow-on consequence in terms of the transfer of risk of loss of or damage to parts of the works. That's the consequence of takeover on the client. And also, having taken things over, there's no need for the contractor to insure those things anymore. The supervisor, as we said earlier, can carry on notifying defects. interesting because they probably won't be on site then. So if the employer who is on site finds a defect, in reality, they're probably going to have to pick up the phone, drop an email to the supervisor, who is then going to do what they have to do and only they can do, which is to notify a further defect. Contractor corrects that defect within the defects correction period. That defect correction period, remember, only starts when we've been given the contractor access. We can still notify a defect 1 hour before the defects date. You finally issue the defect certificate. There's a last payment assessment due, typically 4 weeks from the defects date, at which point retention is taken to 0. And if there is any final assessment of the contractor's share, this if you're in option C or D contract, then that will be taken into account in that final assessment. If there are any defects coming off the bottom of that defect certificate, as I mentioned, PM assesses the cost in 46. That gets included in that final assessment. Sorry about that. The whole slide is repeating what I've been telling you. That said, maybe it's nice to have it all in one place. I can hope. So, Supervisor Summary. 100% focused on compliance with the works information stroke scope. Defects is your big issue, including that final defect certificate, a little bit on title, and that's all you do. But typically, you should also be supporting the PM if you've been asked to do so. There's an article I wrote, which if you're interested in this, I would recommend you to. Obviously, I'm biased, but it was quite a good article, specifically talking about the interaction between the PM and the supervisors, some of which I've mentioned tonight. If you like to read these sort of things, dig that off the NEC's website. Another slide here for when you're thinking about bidding to do the job, which is really quite difficult because it depends what is in the client's mindset. At one extreme, the supervisor role could be just test that the contractors is doing their own quality system properly and audit it once every 2 months. The other extreme is where we used to be. 30 years ago, I spent a lot of time standing watching contractors pouring concrete and making sure they were vibrating it properly. If you want that to be done, you're going to need more people, clearly. So it's very difficult to decide what level of resource is required to do the supervisor role. And as you can see on that slide in green, sort of blatantly obvious, if you get a decent contractor, there's probably going to be less notification of defects and less amount of supervisor needed. So that's an interesting one to talk through with your prospective employer. Where else might you help? Well, if you've ever been to any contracts training, people will have said records, records, records. And typically the supervisor has got the time and the site presence to keep decent records of what's going on site, keep a site diary, decent photographs and so on. If you're on a cost-based contract, then typically the supervisor is the person who is on the lookout for gratuitous dumping of equipment on the site because the contractor's got nowhere else to put it, so I might as well put it on there and hope I get paid for it. Pretty obvious. Early warnings, we've mentioned. The supervisor cannot notify an early warning, but they can and should be telling the PM when they think they should be notified. And in terms of ambiguities, again, it's the PM or the contractor that are contractually notifying ambiguities. But the best job a supervisor can do at the very start of the job is to read the scope from cover to cover and report to the PM on any ambiguities within it. Let's get them sorted out straight away. NEC, the truth will out. I like that slide. NEC shines a light on good management and good documents and poor management and poor documents. It's my way of trying to show that. Hang on, I've got that on the slide. Brilliant. And that's it. That wasn't very exciting, guys. I'm very sorry. What's the time in here? I've probably done, look, exactly 7 o'clock. Any questions from anybody? Robert, have I thrown up any questions, or was it all so dull and boring that everybody's gone home? I wonder.
No, everyone's still with us and have posted some great comments to say thanks for your knowledge share. There are a fair few questions
Okay,
I'm
let me have them.
going to start with Brenda's question, just why I know where it tied into, but it said, does clause 71.1 comply with Scottish law? And that was on the title slide.
Okay, this is where Richard Patterson, I'll do it. You can still see me. I see still me sat here in Cambridge. Hands up. I'm not a lawyer. I'm very sorry. I couldn't possibly comment. That's my simple answer to that one. It's a bit of a duck out, but I really don't know. If you've got any issues with it, then surely take some legal advice. Apologies.
Not a problem. Nothing to apologise for. Moving on, Juan has said, what is the main difference between the Clerk of Works and NEC Supervisor?
Okay, well, what I'd love to do, and I want to tell you what, I'll share that with you, Robert, at the end of this session. God knows how many years ago, I actually wrote an article for the Clerk of Works magazine telling them, honest gov, it's all right, the NEC is not going to hurt, and it's going to be very useful because that's what your type of people will be doing now. As I think I mentioned earlier, in JCT, the Clerk of Works sort of does reporting, sort of looks at testing, but as I understand it, and I'll be honest, I don't know JCT very well. Anybody, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I've been told that the Clerk of Works has no formal role in the contract. They're just an old hand wandering the site and helping out the architect. Whereas in NEC, the supervisor, as I hope you've picked up from my slides tonight, has got a very clear role. You've got to get out there, you've got to notify defects, etc., etc. So the main difference is that, and that's a real issue. If you take people who've been the Clerk of Works for 20 years and put them into being a supervisor, they are going to need some training. Obviously, what we've just done in an hour is a pretty good start on that. It's not a complicated role, to be honest. I'm not saying it's not simple, don't get me wrong, and the quality people that we need to do this properly is important. But the main answer to the question is it's a much more defined role as supervisor. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Ashok has asked, can the PM delegate some of his their duties to the supervisor?
I love the way you dropped into gender neutral there. You went from his to there. Well done, Robert. We're all trying to get there, aren't we? Yes, simple answer. Yes, you can delegate anything to anybody. As I think I mentioned, that might end up with a situation where you may have a person who is the supervisor who has also got some delegated authority of the project manager. What that means is that 1 minute they will be writing to the contractor as the supervisor. The next minute they'll be writing to the project manager as the project manager's delegate. So that individual may well have two different hats, but that's fine. Just understand that you've got two hats and do each of those jobs properly and professionally in accordance with the contract. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Ben has asked, what is your view on part-time site supervision, given the need to keep contemporary records?
Good question. You can always, obviously, we can write into the works information the requirement to keep records, so the contractor can be required to keep those records and take those photos and do all those things. But as I showed in my slide on trying to work out what resource we need, it depends on the client's appetite for or thinking of the need to be looking over the shoulder of the contractor. So clients will always want it part-time because they try and keep the cost down. And forgive me if I tell you a story because I like stories. Many, many years ago now, we had a water industry client who was desperate to keep the cost down. Big job, but they didn't want anybody other than a graduate to do the supervisor role. So fair enough, we advised the client that this really wasn't in accordance with Mott MacDonald policy, blah, blah, blah. But okay, you've told us. And this guy was brilliant. This graduate was fantastic. He kept really good records, did everything really well. When the contractor cut holes in the reinforcing cage for some concrete to a circular water tank, our graduate took the photos and put it in the record books. But he didn't have the experience to know that, bloody hell, the contractor should be putting in some 45 splay bars around that hole in the reinforcement cage. So the water tank was lovely, it was great, until they filled it up with water and it leaked like a sieve. And I've been telling that story for 20 years because it's a really good story about what you get if you go short on decent site supervision. So there's no black and white answer to it, but recognize that there's no right answer to it. I think you should always, as a consultant, you should go into a contract to be the supervisor, saying that you're going to provide this grade person and that grade person for this time, and that you're going to have a sensible grown-up discussion with your client as to whether or not you need to increase or decrease those resources. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Jasmine has asked, is it a supervisor's duty to review contracts design on behalf of the client?
Absolutely 100% no, because clause 21.2 says the contractor submits particulars of its design to the project manager for acceptance. So as we saw in one of my early slides, I'll go back to it. View slide sorter. I think you still got my screen. Oh no, show my screen. Go back to my screen. If you remember this slide, design acceptance, slideshow from current slide. Design acceptance in 2 is 100% the project manager's role. Now it might be that the supervisor's got all the technical knowledge on the job. You can see from that slide the PM needs to be super multi-talented or super supported by people with the right skills. So we need some people with design skills to do design acceptance. As far as the ECC contract is concerned, that role is the project manager, not the supervisor. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. A further question from Jasmine. Can a client's delivery PM instruct a supervisor, or does that communication come from NEC PM?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. Nobody's ever asked me that one before. I love that. That's why I still do this training stuff. Really good point. Be clear that as per this picture, project manager and supervisor are 2 different things. They are 2 different people. They're both employed. They're both employed by the client. They're both paid by the client, and they both take their instructions from the client. So the PM, there's nowhere in the contract where the project manager can tell the supervisor what to do. But in reality, typically, I mean, if MacDonald was employed as both PM and supervisor, typically the PM would be a more senior role, but not necessarily. From a contracts perspective, they are entirely independent roles, and they're both doing what it says in the contract on behalf of and paid by the client. I hope that answers the question. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard, and thanks for the good question, Jasmine. Ben has asked, what is the position in the latest version of the NEC contract regarding disallowed costs in a situation where corrective actions identified in a non-conformist raised under the quality management system have not been implemented, resulting in additional abortive work costs?
Okay, really good question. I'll start you off by saying what I said before about we've only got defects. It's just flipping defects, nothing else. You've got NCRs dropping around in that question. I don't want NCRs. Are they defects or not defects? Sorry, I get passionate about this stuff. So we're just talking defects, and one of the most contentious clauses in the contract, I probably ought to mention this in the session, but I haven't, but I'll do it now. If you go to, hang on, where are we? W3, we must be before that. Hang on a minute, bear with me. Option C, show my screen, sorry. Option C, let's have a look where I am. Well, option E is good enough. So we've got a list of so-called disallowed costs. So under the contract, defined cost is the cost of components, ... less disallowed cost. And then it says disallowed cost is the cost which. And the difficult bullet points are the second bullet point in the second bunch here. So The cost of correcting defects after completion is clearly disallowed, no question. Confusingly, for some, is this second bullet point. Correcting defects caused by the contractor not complying with a constraint on how it is to provide the works stated in the scope. Now, you have to have a little bit of a literal understanding here. The scope is defined as either requirements or constraints, and this defect here is caused by the contractor not complying with a particular constraint. If they don't comply with a requirement and therefore there is a defect, yes, there's a defect. Yes, that defect has to be corrected, but that defect is not a disallowed cost unless it comes in the first bullet point because it's being corrected after completion. Now, this is best illustrated with a silly example. If the contract calls for red doors and the contractor puts in a green door by mistake and has to go off and go back and change the doors, that is a defect, yes, but it's not a defect caused by the contractor not complying with a constraint. It's been as a cause by the contractor not complying with a requirement in the scope, the requirement being I want a red door. Now, in contrast, if the scope had a process which said, for example, the project manager offers up samples of the door color before their installation, if they haven't done that, then that would be construed as not complying with a constraint on how, and therefore that defect, the cost of correcting that defect would then crop into the second bullet point and be a disallowed cost. Now, I've just given you that spiel and I'm hoping it answers the question. Do you want to read the question again for me, Robert? Because I'm not totally sure. Just give me that one more time.
Of course I can. And in Ben's defence, he posted this question before we talked about defects. What is the position in the latest version of the NEC contract regarding disallowed costs in a situation where corrective actions identified in a non-conformist raised under the quality management system have not been implemented, resulting in additional abortive works or costs?
Okay, so I haven't actually answered the question. All I would say is that if you're talking an option C type contract, remember if you're an option A or a B, which is a priced contract, then you're never going to be explicitly paying for defects because the contractor has given you a lump sum price for doing the job. We're only interested in this in the cost-based contracts, which is C, D, E, and F, target, reimbursable management contracts. And then you will pay for the cost of everything, Ben, unless you can specifically pick it out as in one of these bullet points as a disallowed cost. That's where I'm going to leave that answer. I'm not sure it's a very good answer, but I'm going to leave it there. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Ben. Jasmine has asked, so isn't a supervisor required for site visits and signing off works to be in line with the accepted design and technical aspects?
Okay, another really, really good question from Jasmine. You are making my day. Whether or not you need site visits or whether you need to be there full time, that's for you to decide to do your job. The thing I would say is that you mentioned the term signing off. Now, there's nowhere in the contract, this is what my point about the supervisor is so negative. You don't sign off anything as a supervisor. You just decide not to notify a defect. So your whole life as a supervisor is negative Nancy. I don't know whether that's a gender neutral term, but it's a negative sort of role. So nowhere in the contract do you sign to confirm that the contractor has done everything well. Does that make sense? That's a really important point. I think that answers the question as well. Stop.
Excellent.
Correct
Thank you,
me if
Richard.
I'm wrong, Robert.
Yeah. Well, Jasmine, please let us know if you need additional information around that.
Please,
I should say these questions came in with about 15 minutes left of the presentation, but I didn't step in just in case the upcoming information. Jasmine's quickly replied saying, that's perfect, thanks.
Thank you, Jasmine.
So I'll move on to Ashok's question. What happens if the supervisor says deficit is okay, then 9 months after forgets and says it's not okay?
Says what is okay, sorry?
The error, the deficit.
The deficit, I don't know which one, the defect.
Defect, sorry.
Oh, sorry, so presumably if you're saying the supervisor, as I said, informally says that they think it's been corrected, if that defect then crops up on the defect certificate as still not having been corrected, that's a really good question. No, I've never answered that one before. Ultimately, it comes down to the supervised decision as to whether or not there is still a defect there. The fact that they have previously said they thought it had been corrected, like I say, there's no formal process for that to be done. And ultimately, it comes down to the supervised decision in that defect certificate. And if the contractor wants to challenge that decision, they would, like anything else, have to take it through the dispute resolution process. And the fact that 6 months ago, the contractors got good records to show that the supervisor said that they thought that defect had probably been properly corrected, the fact that they said that 6 months ago might not change the supervisor's decision today. And if the contractor doesn't like the supervisor's decision today, they'll just have to go through the dispute resolution process. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. I'll put my teeth back in so I can speak correctly. Hopefully on that one, I've combined a couple of questions there. So thank you for that. I've been asked by James, for a smaller contract, can an individual perform both PM and supervisory role, or supervisor role, sorry?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, definitely. Obviously, if we've got a really small contract, we should be using the engineering construction short contract rather than the big one. By the way, there is no supervisor in that one. It's a bit like the term service contract question we had at the start of the questions. There's just the we just got the client and the contractor, and the client's doing effectively the PM and the supervisor roles. But yes, if it's a small job, then quite possible for an individual to do both roles, no problem. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Achille has said, can a commercial manager review scope?
Good question. If that commercial manager has got competence. Oh, it is a good question, because yes and no. I'm biased because I get paid to do my stuff with NEC, but I would always argue that it's worth making the time and the budget to have somebody review the scope document who is commercially inclined and thinks like a contractor and can make sure that the scope has been written and is in compliance with the language and the way that NEC is set out. I've just done that in the last 3 weeks. I've been working for a job in the rail industry. I know nothing about the rail industry, but I can still be very helpful to that team in reviewing the scope document. So yes, they can, but obviously that commercial person reviewing the scope doesn't take away the need to have a decent technical person also reviewing the scope. And my preference is that we do what the industry in some places calls a category 2 check, meaning that the check of the scope is done by people that have had nothing to do with preparing it. So you get a genuinely independent view and a proper review of that document. Because if nothing else from tonight, you should recognize the importance of that scope document. That scope document has got to be clear, crystal clear, and appropriate for your project. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. This is the final question I've got in my inbox, but if I've missed anyone's question, please repost it. As I say, I did combine a couple. But Dimitri has said, what's the view on small/large jobs in respect of which NEC contract to use?
Oh, well, okay, there's two two questions potentially there. Firstly, do we use the ECC or do we use the engineering construction short contract? And that's a big question, but fundamentally, if you use a short contract, you don't have all of the NEC's programming requirements, which some would see as quite onerous. The short contract is only for priced work, but it can be a mix of lump sums and BOQ items. The short contract is, you can have contractor design under it, but it's very, very light on contractor design. The short contract, of course, hasn't got any of the secondary options. So the short contract, there's no protection for the contractor on inflation and various other things. So whenever you use a short contract, you always have to go through, I'd certainly recommend you go through the ECC's secondary options and see whether you need to pull some of those from the main contract into the short contract. And there's no simple answer. The NEC's guidance is that the short contract should be used for low risk work. I think the short contract is massively underused. I like it a lot and we should be doing it more. That's the decision between the big ECC and the little one. Obviously, if you choose the big ECC, then you've got to choose between your payment options, your A to F, and that's a whole different debate and is not really today's subject. While I'm here, if you want to hear, 9 times out of 10 in the UK, we use either options A, lump sum, or option C, target. The real benefit of C is that in theory, it encourages collaboration because suddenly the client gives a damn about the cost and therefore is incentivized commercially to work with the contractor to help keep the cost down. The massive advantage in contrast for option A is that it's lump sum, payment is damn simple. The other big disadvantage for C is that the client needs to employ people to do the cost audit of the contractor's costs. Sorry, that's going way off the strain of the supervisor role, but I thought I'd drop that in, sort of in answering the question. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Chris has asked, as a supervisor, can I accept sectional completed work on behalf of the client if delegated the authority by the PM?
Absolutely. If delegated, you can do what you've been delegated. Absolutely, yes. Sorry, I was about to shout out, no, that's the project manager's role. But if that has been delegated to you, then fine. I would suggest that would be a very rare thing for the PM to delegate, but I suppose there's no reason why not. Clearly, when you are delegating anything as an organization, you've got to make sure that the person you're delegating to is competent as in experienced and appropriately trained. So if that person has the experience and expertise to do those things, then fine, no problem at all. And the delegation can be, there are no rules on it. Unlike some other contracts, the FIDIC and the international contracts, they've got half a page of garbage on what can and can't be delegated. NEC doesn't do that. NEC leaves it to intelligent people to work out a sensible way to use a sensible contract. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. And final question has come from Alan, who says, does an accepted defect require a design change?
Oh, that's a very, very good question. I love that question. Absolutely brilliant. Give that man a star. 45. Is it 45? I think it is 45. Accepting defects, 45. Showing my screen. So this is the one we talked about. The contractor and project manager may propose to each other that the scope should be changed to accept a defect. So that's a really good question. I might have to struggle to answer that one. If the contractor are prepared to consider the change, the contractor submits a quotation for reduced prices, blah, blah, blah. The project manager changes the scope. So the project manager has effectively said, okay, I'll let you off the defect. I'll change the scope to show that that thing that you did is not a defect anymore, and you can walk away because you've knocked some money off me. So that's my stock answer. But the problem with my answer is that some defects might not be might be nothing to do with the scope. Do you remember the other bullet point on defect was something that doesn't comply with the contractor's design? So if it's something that doesn't comply with the contractor's design and we want to accept that defect, I don't think the contract deals with it directly. That is really fascinating. If the contract is accepted, the project manager changes the scope. But you know, I think you've got me there. That's one of the, I love the question like that, because that's one that I will now send off around my group of 5 mates who are all NEC SADOs and ask them the question. Because logically what you would want, if there was a defect in something which was the contractor's design, what you really want when you finish the job is a set of contractor's design drawings which are effectively the as-builts. And if you're wanting to accept a change in that contractor's design, then as a PM, I would like the contractor to resubmit the design, if you like, showing the defect. And then as PM, I would accept that resubmitted design. And then we're all happy and there's no defect anymore. But there's no words in the contract setting that out in detail. So we'll finish off, Robert, with a good one. And I will go and talk to my other NEC SAD enthusiast and see what we come up with. Stop.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Richard. And I think probably the award for the best question goes to Alan or Jasmine for this evening.
Well, that's very, very good. So thank you to all for you guys that have chipped in questions, because as I hope you understand and agree, it always makes this stuff shed load more interesting. Listening to me drivel on about particular slides is always fairly dull, but it's much better if we get some good questions. So thank you very much for that.
Excellent. Well, Richard, it really leaves me to say thank you on behalf of the APM and everyone who joined us today for your time and knowledge with sharing and answering all the great questions that came in. So thank you.
No problem at all. No problem.
Excellent. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to everyone who's joined us tonight, joined in with the Slido polls, also submitted some great questions. It's great to see everyone this evening, and I know that you've gained a lot of great knowledge from tonight. So thank you. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the APM Thames Valley branch, who have kindly hosted and organised tonight's event. And they've got a lot of additional events coming up, an unconference in December, for example. Please keep an eye on the events page for more information. Within the chat, you'll find a link to the next NEC webinar held by Richard. And in the handouts, you'll also find a little additional information that Richard has kindly given us for you to download and take away with you. It really does just leave me to say thank you again to Richard. Thank you everyone for joining. Keep well, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.
Okay, cheers now. Goodbye.